Welcome back, students. This week we are diving into two fascinating yet often deeply misunderstood mental health challenges: somatic symptom disorders and dissociative disorders. Both of these mental health challenges remind us of something essential. The mind and the body are deeply connected, inseparable. Psychological distress doesn't just stay within our minds. It can show up as physical symptoms. It can show up as memory loss, and it can even disrupt our sense of self and our identity, who we think we are. Let's explore the mind-body connection a little bit further. The idea of mind-body connection isn't just something that sounds poetic. It's a biological and psychological process. Stress activates physiological symptoms in our body, like the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, releasing cortisol and essentially preparing our body for fight or flight. When stress becomes chronic, though, this system becomes overactivated. It affects our sleep, it affects digestion, it affects our immune response, and even our sensitivity to pain. For some people, psychological conflict and trauma can be expressed physically, and that's where somatic symptom and related disorders come in. The key thing to note here is that the symptoms of somatic disorders are very real and can be very distressing. They're not imagined, they're not fake. In somatic symptom disorder, a person experiences genuine physical sensations, and their level of anxiety, preoccupation, and focus on those symptoms can become overwhelming. In illness anxiety disorder, formerly known as hypochondriasis, the main concern isn't the symptom itself, but the fear of having or one day developing a serious illness. In conversion disorder, psychological distress converts into neurological-like symptoms, such as temporary paralysis, blindness, or seizures, without any underlying medical explanation. Take a moment to reflect on why you think people with unexplained medical symptoms are sometimes dismissed or misunderstood in healthcare settings. This week, we're also going to shift our focus from the body to the self. Dissociative disorders involve disruptions in memory, identity, and perceptions of reality. Dissociation can range from mild experiences like spacing out during a long drive to severe fragmentation of identity and even memory loss. These disorders are often linked to trauma, particularly repeated childhood abuse or neglect. In this sense, dissociation can serve as a protective mechanism, a way for the mind to distance itself from the unbearable pain or fear that is that child's reality. Common forms of dissociative disorders include dissociative amnesia, or memory loss for important personal information, often following a traumatic event; depersonalization, derealization disorder, which involves feeling detached from oneself and surroundings, as if they're looking at their own life as if they are watching a movie; and dissociative identity disorder, the presence of two or more distinct identity states, each with its own pattern of perceiving and relating to the world. DID is perhaps the most debated of all mental disorders. The trauma model suggests that DID develops as a defense against overwhelming childhood trauma. The mind literally splits itself into different identity states to manage the conflicting experiences that are that child's reality. If we look at DID from the socio-cognitive model, we may argue that DID sometimes emerges in response to cultural expectations, therapist suggestions, and even portrayal of the disorder in the media. The perspective here is essentially that identity fragmentation is socially reinforced. Neither perspective can fully explain every case, and it's possible that both factors, trauma and social context, are at play here. You may not have heard of DID before, but you've likely heard of multiple personalities, and you can thank or blame the TV movie Sybil for that. Sybil was based on a woman named Shirley Mason and her psychiatrist, Dr. Wilbur. The book and film adaptation depicted Sybil as having 16 different personalities, all rooted in severe childhood abuse. The story of Sybil captivated the public and inspired countless portrayals of DID in television, movies, and novels to come. After Sybil's release, DID diagnoses skyrocketed from fewer than 100 reported cases before the 1970s to thousands by the mid-1990s. However, later investigations suggested that elements of Sybil's story were exaggerated, and some critics argued that her multiple personalities were likely influenced by her therapist's expectations and the surrounding media attention. This raises a really important ethical and scientific question. How do we balance believing patients' experiences while being cautious about the suggestive role that a therapist can play? And how does media exposure shape not only public understanding, but also clinical practice? Media portrayals of DID often focus on sensationalism, this evil alter, or the violent criminal that commits an act of passion in an altered identity. Movies like Split, Fight Club, Identity, Me, Myself, and Irene have all shaped public perception of DID as dangerous or dramatic. In reality, though, most people with DID are not violent. They're survivors of profound trauma. The disorder is not about theatrics, but about coping with the aftermath of chronic abuse. Unfortunately, these portrayals in the media have contributed to stigma and disbelief of the disorder itself, making it harder for people to seek help and receive appropriate care. Take a moment to think about a recent movie or TV show that depicted mental illness, whether it was DID or another mental health challenge. How do media portrayals influence your perception, either positively or negatively, of the people who live with these conditions? Over the last decade, research has significantly deepened our understanding of dissociative identity disorder. We've somewhat moved beyond controversy to recognize DID as a valid, trauma-related condition with measurable neurobiological and psychological features. Let's take a look at what the research has told us. Recent research consistently supports the link between early chronic trauma and the development of DID. Studies across multiple samples confirm that DID patients report higher rates of childhood maltreatment, particularly physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, often beginning before the age of 6. This aligns with the trauma model of dissociation, which posits that DID develops as a defense adaptation to overwhelming, inescapable events in childhood. Neuroimaging studies provide strong evidence that DID involves distinct patterns of brain activation during different identity states, and not simply role-playing or an overactive imagination. For example, MRI studies show varying activation in the hippocampus, amygdala, and anterior cingulate cortex, regions that are linked to memory, emotion, and self-awareness. During trauma regulation, traumatized identity states display higher limbic reactivity, while neutral identity states show suppression of emotional processing. These findings demonstrate that DID is not about pretending. It's about differential neural functioning, reflecting distinct mental and emotional states that exist within the same person. The past decade's research has also helped clarify how DID differs from other mental health conditions. While dissociative symptoms can appear in borderline personality disorder or PTSD or psychosis, individuals with DID show more extensive amnesia, greater structural dissociation, meaning distinct states of consciousness that take executive control, and more severe trauma histories and higher levels of self-reported dissociation. This helps clinicians make more accurate diagnosis and avoid both over and under diagnosis of DID. Treatment research over the last decade has focused on phase-oriented therapy, an approach that proceeds in 3 distinct stages. The first is stabilization and safety, building trust, grounding skills, and managing daily function. The second stage, trauma processing, carefully revisiting traumatic memories while maintaining emotional regulation. And the third stage, integration and rehabilitation, fostering cooperation among identity states and strengthening this unified sense of self. Meta-analysis show that patients who receive trauma-informed long-term psychotherapy experience reductions in dissociation, depression, and self-harm, and improved social functioning. Pause for a moment and reflect why integration in DID treatment may be less about merging identities into one and more about increasing communication amongst identities and shared compassion between them as well. When it comes to treatment for somatic symptom disorders, therapy often focuses on building awareness of how stress stress and emotion affect the body. Using the cognitive behavioral therapy model, using mindfulness and psychoeducation to help reduce health anxiety and reduce catastrophic thinking related to one's health. Some key takeaways for this week's module is to note that somatic and dissociative disorders teach us that psychological pain is not confined to the mind. It reverberates throughout the body and even impacts one's sense of self. And while media portrayals like Sybil have sparked awareness, they've also highlighted the dangers of sensationalization and misunderstanding that can contribute to stigma. Thank you for your attention in this week's overview lecture. I look forward to seeing your active participation in the module, and I hope that you also take a lot away from this week's case study with Bridget, where we see an example of the reality of living with DID.